Hello and welcome to this video edition of the Herald newsletter with me, David Carr, founder and chief editor, coming to you from downtown Belgrade. In this video, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, considered the most powerful military alliance in the world. But does it have a future now? NATO was formed in April 1949 by a treaty, which was signed by 12 original members. The USA, of course, Great Britain, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, and Portugal. Those were the 12 founding members of NATO. And they all signed the NATO treaty, which we're going to look at in a moment. Now, the purpose of it, and remember, this was in the aftermath of World War II, and half of Europe was conquered or occupied, if you like, by the Soviet Union. Half of Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Moldova. And there was a great fear of Soviet expansionism, that the Soviets had ambitions to possibly spread their empire to Western Europe. And that ostensibly was the reason why NATO was created. It was created to form a united military defense pact to, if you like, deter the Russians, which it really was the Russians, from ever attempting to move their forces into Western Europe. However, there was sort of another purpose to NATO too. Of course, I've already mentioned that the eastern half of Europe was occupied by the Soviet Union, which in effect was the Russian Empire. But the western half of Europe was actually conquered by the USA. Now, nobody's ever put that into words. And the reason is because at the end of World War II, the Americans wanted to expand their empire. They never called it an empire, but they did want to expand their empire. And they realized that if they adopted the language of empire and the symbols of empire, and if they called themselves an empire, that would cause resentment. So they disguised this, and they disguised it very cleverly by creating organizations that were ostensibly about partnership and management of the world, but were actually under complete American control. NATO is part of that American imperial control, along with other institutions, incidentally, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But there were pretty clever people running America in those days, and they realized that as long as they didn't call it an empire, as long as they made it less visible, nobody would think of it as an empire, and they wouldn't get any of the problems that come from being an imperial power, which Britain and France had, and Portugal and Spain and other imperial powers. So that was really the other purpose of NATO. And we can see this in effect if we look at the countries where the USA, or the countries in Europe rather, where the USA currently has military assets and military bases. And we're going to look at that now. This is a current map, or as near to current as I can get, and it shows you the extent to which NATO has expanded since its 12 original members, and we'll go on to talk about this shortly. But you can see where all these are European countries, and you can see where the US flag is. In all of these countries, The USA has multiple military assets, air bases, and army bases. So you can see in Britain, in Spain, in Portugal, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, Estonia, Norway, um, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, Greece, Italy, and even in the Balkan countries which are not NATO members. For example, here, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo, which is technically part of Serbia. We'll go on to discuss the reasons for that shortly. So it's an enormous military presence. Now, what do you call it when a foreign country has a military base on your territory? Normally, you would call that occupation or colonization. Can you imagine, for example, the French in 1900 tolerating a British naval base in one of their ports? No, of course not. They would never tolerate such a thing. Interestingly, of course, even today, France hasn't got any US bases there. But can you imagine the Dutch or the Spanish tolerating a British naval or military base in their country 100 years ago? Of course not. They would regard that as having been conquered. But nobody thinks that they've been conquered by America because it's not called an empire. It's not called conquest. It's called an alliance and it's called a military partnership. So that's the way it's cleverly camouflaged. So, how do we know that NATO was ostensibly just a defensive organization? Well, we have to look at the NATO treaty, which the 12 original founding countries signed in 1949. And the treaty isn't very long, but there's two crucial articles in that treaty which set out the obligations, the main obligations of the NATO members. And it would be useful just to look at those now because it helps explain what happens later and to put that in context. Notice here we've got the actual text of the North Atlantic Treaty, and I'm not going to go over all of it. Article 1 is slightly relevant. The parties undertake, as set forth in the Charter of the United Nations, to settle any international dispute in which they may be involved by peaceful means. Okay, so they've got to try that first. But the real operative articles are 5 and to some extent 6. And 5 is very significant. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force. Now, notice the wording there because many people assume that NATO members, having signed up to the treaty, Article 5 means that if, for example, there is an attack on Britain, and the other NATO countries must join in the war. No, they don't, but they just have to take action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force. So notice the clever wording. And the reason it was worded that way was at the insistence of the USA, maybe Britain as well, was so that a small country could not, in effect, drag America into a war that they didn't want to fight. America would have to respond, but not necessarily militarily. But Article 6 is also significant. An armed attack on one or more of the parties is deemed to include an armed attack on the territory of any of the parties. So, in other words, if, for example, France sent troops to fight in another country, not a NATO country, and there were attacks on those troops, that would not be considered as triggering Article 5. It has to be an attack on the actual territory of the member country. And that was more or less the operating system of NATO. At least it was up until the 1990s. And we're going to look at that now. Now, in fairness, NATO did keep the peace in Europe for about 40 odd years. And things were pretty good. Europe was able to develop, recover from World War II as much as they could recover from World War II. Of course, the nations under the control of the Soviet Union, who formed a kind of counterweight to NATO called the Warsaw Pact, stayed under the control of the Soviet Union, but the Russians never, ever tried to invade any NATO country. So it can be seen as successful to that extent. But very significantly, the Soviet Union collapsed in around 1990-91. The Soviet Union was gone. The former members of the Warsaw Pact were released from their empire. They got their independence and their freedom back, and it just became Russia. And it was in a state of turmoil for quite a number of years. Now, notice, of course, that the ostensible reason for NATO's existence was to block any military adventurism by the Soviet Union. But by 1991, 92 perhaps, the Soviet Union no longer existed. By rights, NATO should have shut up shop and abolished itself, because the given reason for its establishment was gone. However, it didn't. It carried on. Why? Because the Americans wanted it to. Because the Americans still wanted all their bases and their control over the countries of Western Europe. And furthermore, it started expanding eastwards, taking in the former countries of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact countries. For a start, Germany unified, and so Germany was a NATO member. Then Poland, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. All these countries became NATO members. So NATO was now right up against the Russian border. And in fairness, it has to be said, these countries didn't have to be dragged kicking and screaming into NATO. They wanted to join NATO. I think they were very fearful about their former colonial master, which is understandable, and they were only too happy to join NATO. Of course, the other benefit to the USA is they have to upgrade their military, and they mostly buy American equipment to do that, as indeed do the Western European countries. So it also provides a steady stream of income to the American military industrial complex. So NATO is a big, important part of not just American power and money, but American hegemony, I think is the word. And this can be seen again in 1999. In 1999, the remains of Yugoslavia were in a civil war, and the civil war was to prevent a province called Kosovo, which was part of Serbia and technically still is, from breaking away from Serbia and forming an independent state. The Serbs went to war to prevent this happening. In return, they were attacked by NATO, who launched a 78-day bombing campaign against Serbia that killed 2,500 Serbian people. Eventually, the Serbian government gave in, and that resulted in a NATO base in Kosovo, and there was also a NATO base in Bosnia as a result of the previous civil war. Now, notice, Serbia did not attack any NATO country, nor did it threaten to, and yet NATO attacked Serbia. So from 1999 onwards, it was impossible for them to maintain that NATO was a purely defensive organization. And this is when the Russians got the message too, that NATO is not going away. It is still a tool of American power, and one day it could be used against them. And it was those fears that led to the rise of Vladimir Putin, and in many respects, the resurrection of Russia as a power. But we're going too far off the subject here. Let's move on to the next section. So let's fast forward now to February 2022. And the Russians launched what they call their special military operation against Ukraine. It's an invasion of Ukraine, if you prefer the term. The Russians don't call it that, but everyone in the West does call it an invasion. And it sort of is, really. Now, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. It wasn't a member of NATO at the time. It'll probably never be a member of NATO now. So, strictly speaking, Article 5 is not triggered because Ukraine's not a member country. However, informally, the British, the Americans, the Germans, the French had all been in Ukraine for years, training and equipping the Ukrainian army and helping them build their defenses around the Donbass. So, although it was not in NATO, it was sort of a vassal of NATO, an extension of NATO. And here comes the problem. The attack on Ukraine cannot trigger Article 5, but nonetheless, all of the NATO countries have responded by rendering assistance to Ukraine as if it had triggered Article 5. And when you add on to that countries like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, a few others, the Russians are now taking on something like 41 countries, including the most powerful country on earth, the USA. And it's become clear in the last few weeks that the involvement of the Americans was not merely sending weapons and money, but American generals and officers were actually in Europe running the Ukraine war. They were actually stationed in Germany. It was really America's war in Ukraine, NATO's war in Ukraine. And here's the problem: they've sort of lost. It's not that Ukraine hasn't been defeated yet, but they've been ground to a halt. They couldn't get any land back that the Russians have already occupied. They can't push the Russians back. And for the Russians, it's really not they're not on a full war footing. They're only on an SMO basis. So, and that's the problem with being the heavyweight champ. Once you lose, your mystique goes, your magic goes, and you've never got quite the same hold on the public imagination again, because people now know that you're beatable. The Russians really have beaten NATO. It's not over yet, but it's looking that way. So, where does this leave us? Well, that was the situation up until the election last November of Donald Trump for his second term, because he made it clear quite early on that he wanted to end America's involvement in Ukraine. And this takes us forward to where we are now. So we're now in April 2025. Donald Trump has been trying to negotiate a deal that will bring an end to the war in Ukraine. So far, that has not been successful. But it's looking increasingly like the Americans are going to start pulling away from this, whether or not there is a deal. And that, of course, has sent the Europeans absolutely crazy, because for the European countries, Ukraine is really the number one issue. The fear of Russia on their doorstep is what is at the top of their minds. It's at the forefront of their minds. And I think there's this feeling in Europe of this great sense of betrayal by the USA. It's really misplaced, because the Ukraine war is a kind of American war in the first place. We'll perhaps have a look at that on another video. But there's a great sense of not just betrayal but worry in Europe, because they're now concerned that if Russia defeats Ukraine, as kind of looks likely, not certain but likely, that will simply whet Vladimir Putin's appetite for further conquests, and then he might attack Poland or the Baltic states or Romania. And what do they do then? And if they haven't been able to stop Russia with full American assistance, how on earth are they going to stop Russia without it? Which is why there's now all these urgent proclamations from just about every European government that they're going to greatly expand their defense spending and they're going to make a priority of it. I don't quite know how they're going to fit it in with their equally robust commitment to net zero carbon, because you can't have electric tanks. But I'm not going to worry too much about those details. But where does this leave NATO? Because NATO is an American project, and without the USA playing a full part of it, does NATO have, in fact, any backbone or purpose? Does it exist? Well, the good news for NATO fans is that NATO, strictly speaking, formally does still exist. Nobody has announced the end of NATO. The Americans have not announced that they're pulling out of NATO. I don't think Donald Trump can actually do that. I think if the USA was to formally withdraw from NATO, I think he needs an act of Congress for that. Please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But it's very clear that if the USA no longer has that trust in Europe, and Europe no longer has that trust in the USA, then is NATO dead in all but name? And if the Russians did attack, say, Poland or Estonia or Romania, and if the Americans say, we're not going to do anything about it, then NATO is as dead as a doornail. And I think there's a growing realization of this in Europe, and we're going to look at that next. Let's look now at this article in the Financial Times, and it's very recent. It was published on April the 10th, so it's only about a week old. But look at the headline: Coalition of the Willing meets at NATO without the US. So it's NATO, but America's not there, which is kind of giving you a flavor of things to come. Let's go down to the meaty bits. Western defense ministers gather at NATO today to discuss a potential military deployment to deter a Russian invasion without the US around the table. Those in attendance will hope it is not a grim harbinger of Europe's future. Context: defense officials from 30 countries in the Franco-British led Coalition of the Willing meet today at Military Alliance Brussels headquarters to discuss proposals for a reassurance force in Ukraine to ensure a post-conflict peace deal. Note it's post-conflict. They won't send any troops in unless the conflict has been settled. I don't think they're ever going to send any troops in, but well, maybe I'm being too judgmental there. Donald Trump's administration has vowed it will not join the coalition, but European participants have said some form of US backstop is a prerequisite for deployment. What they mean is an American security guarantee, which Donald Trump has already said he's not going to give. So I don't see how they're going to get that. Diplomats preparing today's meeting played down the significance of US absence in the NATO setting, but squirmed at the symbolism of at a moment when many European capitals are worried about Trump withdrawing US support from the alliance. Now, I must make it clear, Donald Trump has not said as much. He has not said that he wants to withdraw America from NATO, which would be the end of NATO. It's an American organization. And the rest of it, the talks come as efforts by the US to force Russia and Ukraine into a peace deal are losing steam amid rising frustration at Moscow's apparent unwillingness to engage with proposed terms. So you can see the way this is going. If it is an alliance, it's an alliance that's kind of falling apart already. And if you see it in terms of it being an extension of the American empire or a manifestation of it, then we may have got to the stage where the Americans decide that they're going to reorient their empire elsewhere and that they just don't need NATO anymore. So that's where we are now here in April 2025. And I go back to the question that I raised at the very start, at the very foot of the video. Is there a future for NATO? I have to say, it's very hard to see a future for NATO as an institution. Because even if Donald Trump decides that he wants America to stay in NATO, how are NATO's European colonies stroke partners going to trust America and going to have any faith that America will help defend them if the Russians did indeed attack another European country? I don't think the Russians are going to do that, but you never know. There clearly is, this is for Europeans, an existential issue. And the problem with any organization, regardless of if it's a kind of empire or if it's an alliance, whatever name you want to call it, is there does need to be a degree of trust. And it seems that trust has been lost. Donald Trump has broken it. And he was able to do that because he made a decision that America had no further interest in Ukraine or Eastern Europe. It didn't suit American purposes. And that's the problem when you're somebody else's colony. You become subject to their whims. America now looks as if it's going to pivot towards the Pacific and their own hemisphere, in which case they will probably start withdrawing military assets from Europe, slowly at first, but then quite quickly. And it may be that Donald Trump simply says, look, guys, NATO's finished. And the Europeans, as much as they're reluctant, are forced to agree with him. And that's it. NATO comes to an end. For the moment, it still exists, but it may well just wither on the vine because the heart has been ripped out of it. And albeit that Donald Trump doesn't pull America out of NATO, what's he going to do with it in future? It's got no place in the Pacific, and the Europeans can't really act in the Pacific. So the Americans may decide that it's an organization or an institution, an arm of their empire they no longer need, so they'll just lop it off. I don't think there'll be any great announcement that NATO's at an end. You never know, but probably not. It's just something that will fade gradually into memory. And the Europeans, if they want to defend themselves, are now going to have to think not just about a coalition of the willing, but a coalition of the able, and completely reorient the thinking that they've been subjected to since 1945. They're kind of on their own now. So that's it. Thanks for listening. Please remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell. This has been a pleasure for me. I hope it's been informative for you. And do join me next time on the next video from the Herald newsletter. Good night.